When we observe a cluster of dividing cells, we eventually reach a biological threshold where inert matter appears to receive a sudden charge of complex animation. Charak's Sharir stan operates on the premise that human anatomy is incomplete without a map of the conscious entity that perceives the physical tissue. Modern practitioners often isolate the physical Pancha Mahabhutas, focusing on biological hardware while the cognitive software remains unaddressed. The classical solution is the Chatur-Vinshatika Purusha, a rigorous 24-element architecture that governs how consciousness merges with material form. To understand this system, we must reverse engineer the blueprint and define the biological parameters required to boot it up inside the womb. Within this framework, treating a disease without understanding the cognitive hierarchy is like attempting to fix a software error by replacing the computer's monitor. Human existence originates in avyakta, the unmanifest void that precedes the very first signals of physical form. This flowchart traces the sequential descent of consciousness. Avyakta generates the intellect, or mahan, which produces ahankara. Here, ahankara splits the system into three frequencies: sattva, raja, and tama, driving the creation of the sensory organs and the physical elements forming the body. This entire architecture relies on a singular structural bottleneck to regulate data flow: the mind, or manas. The text defines the mind through two strict operational qualities: anutva, its atomic size, and ekatva, its total singularity. Because the mind is singular, we process sensory data in a sequence. If it were not, the intellect would be overwhelmed by 5 simultaneous streams of raw sensory input. This makes the mind the indispensable bridge, routing information between the immaterial soul and the physical body. When we apply this blueprint to the physical womb, we must identify exactly what causes a fetus to assemble. The classical texts use the Khandhan method, a logical system of refutation, to eliminate insufficient theories of reproduction. The first logical proof refutes the idea that the mother and father alone are sufficient to create life. The clinical evidence is clear. If parents were the sole cause, healthy couples would never experience unexplained infertility. A second refutation targets the theory of rasaja, or the idea that perfect nutrition is the independent cause of birth. If nutrition alone created life, individuals maintaining perfect diets while remaining celibate would spontaneously reproduce. While biological inputs are necessary, basic gross chemistry alone lacks the sheer complexity required to manifest a human being. Charak instead proposes the Garbhotpati bhavas, a hexapartite equation of 6 factors required for viable life. The matriya and pitriya factors contribute physical building blocks. The mother provides soft organs and blood, while the father provides the skeletal structure. The rasaya and satmaya nodes provide the continuous material supply and ensure environmental viability within the mother's system. Sattvaja establishes the fundamental mental disposition of the fetus. These 5 biological and psychological components remain inert without the final, non-negotiable variable, the spiritual factor, Atmaja. Without the Atmaja factor, the biological inputs fail to organize into a living entity. This factor is the connection point where the 24-element software architecture we mapped earlier uploads into the physical fetus. Once the system is active, the physical outcomes are dictated by precise mathematical ratios of reproductive tissue. The predominance of paternal shukra, or maternal artava, at the moment of conception determines the biological gender. This operates as a sliding scale, where the ratio of data inputs produces a specific physical result. But when these physical inputs are corrupted, the assembly process itself fails. Vitiated vata or pitta can damage the reproductive tissues or the uterine environment, a process the texts call vitiation. This localized corruption fundamentally damages the biological hardware of the fetus, resulting in highly predictable developmental defects, or in severe cases, complete infertility. From this perspective, congenital disease is the physical manifestation of a corrupted embryonic blueprint. We can now bring these 2 distinct conceptual frameworks face to face. The 24-element Purusha represents the software architecture of human consciousness. The 6 Garbhotpati factors represent the physical hardware assembly sequence. When the Atmaja factor connects these two models, the consciousness architecture successfully uploads into the material body. For the practitioner, this means that treating only the physical tissues addresses only half of the human system. Effective treatment requires managing both the material inputs, like nutrition, and the cognitive architecture of the mind and intellect. Because the mind is the singular bottleneck for all sensory data, systemic health depends on the intellect's ability to govern it. When the intellect fails to maintain this order, a state called prajna parada, the cognitive blueprint begins to destabilize. The Sharir Stan defines human anatomy as a unified architecture that originates in consciousness and manifests through matter.